Hello and welcome to New Economic Thinking. I'm here today with Professor Gabriel Zucman, who is a professor of economics at UC Berkeley. Professor Zucman, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
You have been engaged in the study of inequality since your PhD days. It was rather far-sighted of you because I don't expect when you first started that it was a particularly popular discipline in the economics profession.
Well, it has actually been a very important topic for centuries. When you think about the founders of, the economics discipline, Ricardo, Marx, they were very much interested in that particular question, what are the long-run trends in income and wealth concentration, what are the forces that tend to make income more or less concentrated. But then it's true that interest, in those issues declined.
Certainly in the post-war period, I mean, it certainly was not an area that was considered to be worthy of a serious economic study for whatever reason.
Well, it declined, partly for bad reasons, partly for good reasons, in the sense that just after World War II, inequality was at a low, historically low level, and stayed at a low level in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. It's only since the 1980s that inequality, has started to increase again, and economists have, taken a little bit of time to notice, but now, there's a lot of interest, obviously, in those issues.
And speaking of taking time to notice, you, along with Professor Emanuel Saez, have recently concluded a paper where you've developed a lot more detailed, seeking to quantify the extent of that inequality. And you've looked at the U.S. National accounts, the tax system, not only to gauge income levels, but also to gauge growing inequality. So can you share some of your findings from that work?
Yes, what we try to do is to provide better figures on the concentration of wealth. We know that income inequality has increased a lot in the US, but for wealth, there's conflicting evidence. So what we do is that we implement a relatively new method which involves capitalizing the income that people report on their tax returns. The dividends, interest income, rents. From that income, you can try to infer the wealth of people.
Because of course, what's really the important area here is wealth inequality as opposed to income inequality.
Exactly.
And that's certainly been the more prominent cause of the growing disparity.
It depends on the countries, So first of all, there's much more data on income traditionally than on wealth, for the simple reason that most countries have an income tax. You can use the income tax to study income concentration. Most countries do not have a wealth tax, so you need to use, somewhat indirect methods. And that's what we try to do in this work with Emanuel Saez. Wealth is important because in the long run, it determines a big part of income concentration. Why is that so? It's because at the top of the income distribution, most of income actually derives from wealth, in the sense that most of income comes from dividends, interest, rents, and business profits. And so if wealth tends to become more concentrated, income down the road will be more concentrated too. And so that's why it's very important to try to better quantify wealth inequality and better understand the forces that are pushing wealth inequality up right now in the US.
So can you quantify some of the data from the base of your paper?
So what we found is that the top 0.1% wealth share in the United States, so that's a relatively small group of the population, 160,000 families, it used to own about 7% of US wealth in the 1970s. Now it owns 22% of US wealth. That's as much as the bottom 90% of the wealth distribution. So the top 0.1% wealth share is as high as the bottom 90% wealth share. And you have this spectacular U-shape pattern in the top 0.1% wealth share over the last 100 years. So 1 century ago, wealth concentration was high, declined a lot during the Great Depression and World War II. It stayed low in the post-World War II decades, and it's been rising continuously since the 1980s. So that's the key finding. The other key finding is that the bottom 90% wealth share has declined a lot. So middle-class wealth, many people think that middle-class wealth is much more important today than a century ago, for two reasons. pension wealth, what was non-existent a century ago now is very important, and housing. Home ownership rates have increased, and so there is this view that the middle class is now much wealthier than it is a century ago. And that's true, but as a share of total wealth, actually
In
the middle
relative terms, as
class,
opposed to
in
absolute terms.
relative terms, is not doing great in the US right now.
And do you think that's the more important gauge when people talk about prosperity, well-being? They don't look at that in absolute terms. They look at that in relative terms, how they are doing in relation to, say, their neighbors, their communities, as opposed to saying, well, I'm certainly wealthier than I was 30 years ago, and so I don't really care about inequality per se.
Of course, I mean, these shares, matter a great deal. If a tiny group of the population, controls an extremely high fraction of income and wealth, this can have all sorts of political consequences. What the interest of the top 0.1% has no reason to be particularly aligned with the interest of the broader public. Very wealthy individuals, they don't need social security, they don't need nearly as much public goods and services as ordinary people do. And that's why it's important to look at shares and not only at absolute income or wealth levels, although both matter, a great deal.
Although you mentioned the 1980s as a point at which that traditional disparity began to grow again, and that is not uncoincidentally at the time when the welfare state came under a full frontal attack again.
It's also the time when progressive taxation started to unravel in the US and to decline. So, for a very long time, from the late 1930s to 1970s, the US had very high top marginal income tax rate on what was called unearned income, so dividends.
As high as 90% in the
as high as 90%. It also had very, very high top inheritance tax rates. It was very much a US invention. That's not something that you saw in Europe, or at least not in continental Europe. And then all of this reversed, starting in the early 1980s. The top marginal income tax rate declined, inheritance tax rates decline, and that's when we see top wealth shares starting to rise.
And the traditional neoliberal argument has always been, you start cutting these tax rates, you're going to unleash the productive potential of all these people who've been held back by high tax rates. And you would expect to see that manifested in the growth rates, GDP. But in fact, as I recall, I wasn't alive for all, but certainly in the 50s and 60s, growth rates on average were much higher than they were in the 80s, 90s, and certainly the 2000s.
Well, it's true that, that the countries that have cut the top rates the most are not those that have experienced a particularly strong, GDP growth. So there's basically no correlation if you look at the cross-section of countries. Now, there are tons of things, happening at the same time. Today's world is very different than 1950s, 60s, much more globalized. So it's hard to tease out the causal effect of top tax rates on growth, but it's true that there's no evidence for this argument, this trickle-down argument that the more you cut taxes on the very wealthy, the more growth you get.
It's another one of those truisms. It's much like the argument about the minimum wage, that if you raise it, say, to $12 or $15 an hour, that you're going to create a lot higher marginal unemployment. When in fact, in the 1960s, if you look at it in an inflation-adjusted minimum wage, it's much higher than what it is today, and you had 3-4% unemployment during that period.
Yes, I mean, in all those debates, unfortunately, there's a lot of ideology, a lot of very ideological positions, like it's good to cut taxes as a matter of principle, the government has to be the smallest possible as a matter of principle, and not enough hard evidence on what actually happens when you change tax policy, what are the elasticities, that matter for policy. And what we try to do in our work is to bring data and facts to the discussion. Okay, and we certainly don't claim to have any definitive answer to any of those complicated questions, but if you don't have facts and figures to study inequality and how inequality changes when policy changes, well, you can't really have an informed discussion.
And you've contributed substantially with your scholarship towards having an informed discussion, and hopefully more rational policy will flow from that as a result. Gabriel Zucman, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.